During the Cold War, the United States alone spent enough money on nuclear weapons and the methods for carrying them to have purchased everything in the United States except for the land.
The stupidity of war. When you see that word stupidity, it almost short circuits your thoughts. When you think about a book like yours and your work, you might think the wisdom of war, the tragedy associated with war, but instead you use the word the stupidity of war. Is it fair to say that that was intentionally almost poking fun at a leader that would think war is an option? How intentional was the word stupidity? Because it's incredibly powerful.
Well, actually, the publisher wanted to use the word you use, namely the wisdom of war. And I suggested, okay, that's pretty good. Let's just change one word. So into the stupidity of war. And basically what the book is a biography of the idea that war is really stupid. Although there's been people like that who've thought about that forever, going back millennia, including Shakespeare, I think, it didn't really become common until after World War I in this century. And mainly not with war in general, but with international war. So after World War I, there was before World War I, it was extremely easy to find intellectuals, militarists, of course, art critics, composers, historians, talking about war in the most glowing terms. It's beautiful, seductive, reductive, progressive, necessary, and just on list of words like that. Incredibly easy to find. After World War I, it's extremely difficult. I found maybe 2 people have said something like that since World War I. So there was this massive change. And the result of World War I was basically people saying that was really, really stupid. It is obviously destructive and horrible and a lot of other things, but let's not do that anymore. So a movement started at that time, basically really trying to change one of the most ancient traditions and institutions of the human race. And it's been successful substantially.
Is there value using that word, stupidity, or almost humor, in a sense, dismissal? Is there value as a useful tool to not give credibility like wisdom or offer the opportunity for debate? Using the word stupidity is almost a dismissal or an element of humor. Is that an effective tool to really make your point clear?
Well, I hope so. It basically cuts through. I think that's what they thought after World War I. That was really stupid. They didn't use that word particularly. But how did we get into that? Why did it last so long? It was horribly destructive. We would have been infinitely better off without it. In other words, it was really a stupid maneuver. The words like horribly destructive, immoral, and so forth, of course, are also used. And I certainly don't have trouble with those words.
You mentioned this briefly about World War I and the public sentiment from World War I to World War II. It's very interesting because I've kind of been obsessed with documentaries on the First World War and Second World War, but I had no idea. You're saying there was like a romance and there was overwhelming public support. Where does that come from? Because it feels like it's incredibly obvious, World War II and on, that there would be public pushback, but the idea of actual like romance and it's our purpose to get into a war, was that the consensus in World War I?
That was a consensus before World War I. That basically they're inevitable, they're progressive, they get men to fight men, and display their manliness and so forth. Their honor is saved and so forth. After World War I, it's virtually impossible to find it. In fact, there's a interesting thing I came across after I finished the book, but I was still able to sneak it in, a thing on Wikipedia. And it just as a catalog of all the anti-war plays that ever been written. There are 3 during the ancient Greeks, and the next one is 1929. I think they skip over Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, but nonetheless, and then basically after World War II, it's very hard to find anybody that had anything good to say about war, including actually Adolf Hitler, at least in the developed world, in Europe in particular. Not the one place where you could still find it was Japan.
Wow, it's hard to wrap my head around that as a 26-year-old to imagine a world where it was actually considered progressive. But on the topic of the stupidity of war, what is the stupidest reason for a war in recorded human history? The stupidest reason a population went to war?
Quite possibly the stupidest war in history is one of the most famous, namely the war between Greece and Troy. It was fought over an errant wife. It lasted 10 years, and it ended up in the total destruction of Troy. Everybody, all the men were killed. The women were either killed or after being raped, or they were sold into slavery, and the place was burned to the ground. It took 2 millennia to even find where Troy had been. And there's still question about whether that's the case. So there's a lot of stupid wars. World War I was a stupid war. They sat back and said, how did we get into that? And also, why did it continue? And the best way to solve that problem is just not do it anymore. Again, international war. You still have colonial wars. You still have civil wars. But the idea of that kind of war, we shouldn't do again. And I argue in the book, as you know, that in Europe, the only, I give like 20 historians basically say this, the only European who wanted war was Adolf Hitler. If he had been driven over by a truck, World War II probably would not have happened in Europe. The Japan War might have happened, but not that. John Keegan, for example, one of the most prominent of military historians, says that only one European still wanted war, and that was Hitler. And Hitler was successful in part because he hid that. That was the biggest lie. He didn't lie about his anti-Semitism, for example. That's pretty clear that he was anti-Semitic. But he said repeatedly in speeches in the 1930s that he hated war. He did not want to do war. He fought in the war. He was gassed in World War I, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, he was partly successful in considerable part because Europeans couldn't believe that anybody would actually want to do war again. And it turned out Hitler did. But without him, there's virtually nobody, including in Germany, including at the high level, including certainly in the public opinion, that wanted to do anything like World War I again. So he made it happen.
That's incredibly interesting. I have a note here actually that says, ? No Hitler, no World War II. And it's very hard to believe that one person, you think that Germany at the time had public momentum and this was inevitable. If it wasn't Hitler, it was going to be someone else in his camp. But you sound pretty clear that no Hitler, no World War II. And it's incredible that one man had that much power. It's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. I agree. He really is the man of the century in the most tragic way, obviously. So I don't know what's likely to, but basically I've looked at the other Nazis. They're fanatics and, of course, sycophants. They do anything Hitler told them, but they didn't think it on their own. And it's very hard to find them or in the military who could have pulled it off or wanted to pull it off. There was distinct bitterness with the stakes, what happened after World War I. In other words, they wanted some sort of rectification for some of the things that were sort of jammed down their throat, the Germans did. That was quite popular. But the Allies, the British and the French, were in the process of giving them back, saying, okay, we went too far. Then Munich, in 1938, giving them part of Czechoslovakia, was part of that appeasement, saying, okay, you've got some grievances, we agree, this is not a great idea, but if this is, as Hitler said, my last territorial demand in Europe, and I want no Czechs. I only want this area that has a bunch of Germans in it, in Czechoslovakia, and that's it. And they said, okay, you can have it. If any other German had said that, that would have been the end. They would not have gone on to others. There would have been some tinkering around the edges, some concerns about Poland and so forth. But it's quite clear to me, and lots of historians have essentially come to this conclusion, that he was totally crucial to that happening.
That's very uncomfortable to even think that one person had that much sway and power. You watch the documentaries of him speaking in black and white with 10, 40,000 people screaming at every word, and you kind of can get caught up that the public was overwhelmingly in agreement to what he was doing. So you're saying in private, I assume there wasn't a free press, but in private, the German public is saying, why the hell are we going into another world war after what happened?
Yeah, it looked like tinkering around the edges at first. But it was all Hitler's idea. In the speeches, if you translate them into English, they're all about how great Germany is as a nation, and they're pacifistic. He even uses racism. I mean, this is amazing. He uses racism to say I couldn't possibly want another war because he says, "Read my stuff. I'm a racist. What if I do? What would I do if I take over Poland? I'd have a bunch of Poles. A lot of Germans would die. The best Germans would die in fighting the Poles, and then I'd have a country that is polluted with this inferior race." So that would, I mean, he was he was amazing. But basically, then he announced to the military. He didn't never said any of this out loud. In fact, he said afterwards, necessity was made it necessary. It was necessary for me to talk about peace for so long, and it was totally a lie. He talked to his generals and he started pushing toward war. He invented the Blitzkrieg. He then basically was the only one really pushing for the attack on France in 1940, which was an incredible success. Then, of course, his ultimate goal was the drive to the east. And there were a lot of Germans who liked the idea of sort of expanding and so forth, but not to that extent by any means. Sort of in the mythology to a degree, but it's basically no one who really wanted to risk a major war to do that.
You always think about the evil of Hitler, and I've always wondered the amount of sheer resources that he put towards his racist beliefs in the Holocaust. If Hitler wasn't a racist, if he didn't pour resources and his army towards the Holocaust and just focused on territory, is there a chance there would be a different outcome of World War II, or were those resources not enough to actually sway that war?
Yeah, it was. Well, of course, the reason for the war was racists. Because he was going to exterminate or make people in the way into slaves and so forth. But the war was very successful for a considerable period of time until he got bogged down in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union fought so intensely because he was a racist. I just been looking at a film from 1985, an anti-war film out of the Soviet Union called Come and See. And it's clear they said, if we don't get this guy, if we don't stop the Germans, they're going to exterminate us. And that was more or less true. So when you got that in front of you, you may not be much of a war, hawk, but obviously, if the only choice is death or fighting the guy coming in, surrender doesn't enter into the meaning, because if you know it's surrender, you're going to be killed. But the racism was part of it, basically. It basically was his ultimate undoing.
When I was growing up, I'm Canadian, and I remember hearing a lot that when the U.S. stepped in, the U.S. helped win World War II. And as I've gotten a little older and watched enough documentaries and read a few books, it kind of felt like the Soviet Union actually won World War II. Do you see the debate or the rewriting of history? And is it accurate to say that without the Soviet Union, that would have ended much different?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right on that. The Soviets say that all the time. The Russians say that all the time, and it doesn't get much play here, and it should. But just as an objective fact, I have not yet been able to find exactly what percentage of the deaths in the European sector among the Allies were suffered by the Soviets, the Russians in particular. I've heard 93%. That seems to be a bit high, but I've talked to 2 or 3 people who've written histories about World War II. And I said, what's that number? And of course, the casualty rates are hard to calculate anyway, particularly on the Eastern Front. But it's going to be somewhere in that neighborhood. Maybe it's only 80% or something, but nonetheless, overwhelmingly the casualty rate, the battle death rate, was suffered by the fighters in the East.
Looking back on history and all the historians you know and speak to, is it just common in humanity that the winner rewrites history? Is this just as old as can be, that there's inaccuracies in our history thanks to the winner?
Yeah, the winner's justice and so forth. Yeah, but the historians are conditioned and to try to get it right. And of course, they focus on things which are they certainly start with things that are easier to access. And for a long period of time, it was very hard to get much information about what happened on the Eastern Front. In fact, during World War II, there's a catchphrase in the United States. Someone say something you didn't understand, and they say, well, that's about as clear as the news from the Russian front. No one, even at the time, knew it.
Wow.
And they knew there was a war going on, obviously, but what exactly was going on. And it was really 10 or 15 years after World War II that we began to get much better information about exactly what happened on the Russian front. So it's if you want to write something and you can't get information, you might want to talk about the Battle of the Bulge. It's perfectly worth writing about things that happened in the West, where you could get really good information, and the others came in somewhat later. But I think there is this bias of not really giving the Russians credit for the horrors that they suffered during that war.
Is it accurate to say post World War I, the reparations and the deal that was signed by Germany was so difficult and almost unrealistic for that economy that created the motivation and a talking point for the politicians that rose for World War II? If there was a fairer World War I reparation deal, would that take away some of that political ammo? Is there any accuracy in the unfairness of that deal?
The way I put it is that the insecurity and the outrage at Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles and so forth, in 1918, was one of the reasons Hitler was successful. He was able to play on that. Other Germans played on it too. I mean, it was not, if you want to win elections, you can say nice things about, the Treaty of Versailles in Germany. It was very much agreed upon. The issue was not that people disagreed with the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted rectification, and they got some of it in the 30s from the British and the French. But whether they were willing to use war to try to rectify that, an international war like World War I, and overwhelmingly, there's studies of public opinion in Germany during that time, which said people are overwhelmingly afraid of war. No more, at least as much as in France, Belgium, or Britain, or any place else. It was just overwhelming. But what happened during the war, during the Nazi period, was that the Nazis didn't have public opinion polls, but they did have sort of listeners going around listening to what people were saying, on the streetcar, on the street, in the grocery store, or whatever that. And they report this back. It's not terribly systematic, but they're pretty careful about it. And what they reported back to their chiefs in Berlin, was that the country was, while they definitely agreed about trying to redo Versailles, they were not the least bit interested in going through what they went through before. And then, of course, they eventually did.
I've always wondered what happens during these treaties, whether it was World War I or World War II. I'm sure they were very different. I wonder what happens. Does the losing countries go to the table and get honest conversations, or is it you're sitting down, all of our terms we're agreeing to as the winners, and you have no say? Or is there actual discourse and try to have a realistic debate, or once you've lost, you just sit at the table and sign whatever comes?
Yeah. Well, after World War II, there was a realization about the stupidity, essentially, of Treaty of Versailles, that they basically, it was too vindictive and crazy. On the other hand, Germany after World War II was divided in four pieces. I mean, it really suffered a lot. And it also suffered horribly in the war as the Russians came through from the east in particular. But the basic idea of after World War I was the same as basic idea after World War II. Let's not do that anymore. So the way I look at World War II is basically a reinforcing effect. Got rid of Hitler, of course. It also pacified the Japanese. After World War II, it was the chief thing to do, but most important thing was not have international war like that again. That was the attitude after World War I. It didn't work, obviously. And so they revived it after World War II, and it has worked. Europe, this is sort of a key part of my book. Europe has now been at peace from freedom of international war for the longest period of time since the word Europe was invented about 2,500 years ago. And Europe used to be the most warlike continent in the world. and in the world. And now it's been virtually completely free of international war for 75 years. It's an astounding achievement. Furthermore, other developed countries have also been a part of that, even Australia and so forth, that are not part of Europe directly. And I think the Soviet Union felt the same way. They didn't want to do it again. And in addition, what has happened now is that international war itself is ceased to exist. In the last 30 years, there were wars between India and Pakistan, there were wars between Israel and Arab states and so forth. But those pretty much came to an end in the early 70s. So there were other international wars outside the developed world. But in the last 30 years, there's only been 3 international wars as they're usually defined. One was between Ethiopia and Eritrea at the end of the 20th century. And the other 2 were the wars started by the United States after 9/11 against Saddam Hussein in Iraq and against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Wars which were successful short term, but of course devolved into, very tragically, into wars of attrition and of insurgency.
Hypothetically, in a very hypothetical universe, if Hitler decided to enter peace talks months before the world ends, if he, for whatever reason, folds, makes the call, sits down for peace talks, how would the world treat A, Hitler entering into peace talks after the destruction, and then B, once the Holocaust is uncovered? In a hypothetical sense, how does the world respond to Hitler trying to do a peace treaty?
Yeah, they just wouldn't have accepted it. Certainly the Russians wouldn't. They would just kept rolling on. And what happened is Hitler had to die. He killed himself, of course. And then other Germans said, "Okay, let's stop this," and that was accepted. The Germans were not exactly in a good bargaining position, shall we say, but nonetheless, then there were peace negotiations were begun, and and Hitler, and since World War II, Germany has been amazingly peaceful. And right after World War II, people thought it was, the German instinct or something like that. And that's certainly been disproven now for 75 years.
Did high-level Nazis, after all this, did they flee and go undercover? Were there some that tried to denounce Hitler and try to get involved in the new Germany? Where did a lot of those high-level guys that survived the end of World War II end up?
Well, some of them stayed in Germany and were accepted. The people at the top, there were the Nuremberg trials for the top Nazis. Generally speaking, it worked out pretty well in the sense that we still, if you take over Germany, you still need people to run Germany. And there's a certain number of people who are pretty good at it, just plain running government and so forth. And some of them have been Nazis. So you would be a little bit careful about it and so forth. But nonetheless, these people were perfectly willing to cooperate in that sense. And the Allies tried to make use of them, but it was awkward. And you try to get somebody who didn't have a Nazi background and so forth. And the same with Japan. After the war, the issue is, who's going to run Japan? Well, there's a lot of Japanese know how to run Japan. We'll get rid of, obviously, the super militarists who really are converted, which they were, and willing to work cooperatively for a peaceful Japan. It's fine. I mean, look, one of the greatest achievements in international history is what happened after World War II. What happened after World War II is the Germans and the Japanese came to view the world pretty much the same way as the guys on the other side, the people who bombed Dresden and the people who bombed Hiroshima. And that's been really good for the Germans, really good for the Japanese, and really good for the victors of World War II.
After the sheer destruction of World War II and the rebuilding process, I always wondered because, the documentaries end when you just see Berlin in rubble. How long did it take to get some semblance of a normal life when things were rebuilt? There were new buildings, there was a new stable government. How long is that process from rubble to a new Germany that is starting to, in some ways, thrive?
Well, it's very brief. three or 4 years.
Wow.
The best statistic, if you say, at what point did Western Europe and Germany and France and so forth get back to the same level economically as they had been in 1938 before the war? And generally speaking, is pretty fast. I mean, amazingly fast. It took, for example, after World War I, in which Germany was not invaded, it took 10 years before they were able to get back to where they'd been in 1913 before the war. And that just basically shows the power of the modern economies. Obviously, war was not in the equation in any sense, or even much worrying about it for the most part, of the World War II type scenario. And they basically got into it, and of course Japan, the losers of Japan in Japan and losers in Germany are incredibly prosperous. And what they've given up, though, is the idea that you want to do war to become more prosperous, or to be redemptive, or to have your honor covered, or to all that glory stuff. All that is shot, hopefully, to hell. And I think, in general, one of the points of my book is that more and more people had to realize that war is really stupid. And what you can do if you want to get rich, first of all, you have to want to get rich. Some people said, "What do you mean getting rich? That's like, that's like booty and stuff. We don't want to get rich. We want to be honorable, and we want, and glorious and all that kind of stuff." We have Immanuel Kant called war sublime. And to a degree, that's true in the sense you get into battle. It's sublime in the sense that you can't think about anything else except, people are shooting at you. So it's sort of an out of body experience in that sense. But people said, we can live without that crap. And people said, no, everybody's always had wars all the time. And now we've had this incredibly long period of time in which there have been no international wars. And the book basically celebrates that and argues that it's potentially, will continue for a long period of time, maybe forever. It's a major change at any rate.
I wanted to go back to your book and talk about the word complacency because, we have a lot of younger listeners. I'm 26, and young men typically want to be proactive. They are a bit more aggressive and immature. And the word complacency is almost like a dirty word for a young, ambitious, ego-driven man. But you use the word in a very rational and obvious sense. And one of my goals for this conversation was to actually really double down on the word complacency and why it's one of the most powerful words when referring to war and our future. So maybe let's dive into the word complacency, why it gets pushed back, and why it's probably the most important word to be proud of when referring to conflict.
Well, basically complacency is let me epigram about that, which is from Calvin Coolidge. He said, if you see 10 problems coming down the road at you, chances are 9 of them will go into the ditch before they ever get to you. Now, it doesn't mean you 1 out of 10 is going to be a problem, so you have to still be alert. But by and large, I think that's true. When I argued during the Cold War, there was no danger of a major war. The Soviet Union had suffered through that disaster, and it did have an idea about taking over the world, and that was through subversion and supporting communist parties and other kind of parts of the world and so forth. But that's not direct war. And sometimes violence. They were in favor of class revolution and class warfare potentially as part of this. But they had no interest at all in doing that. So all the argument and all the money, something like $5 to $10 trillion that was spent during the Cold War on machines and bombs, mostly atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, to deter the Soviet Union were simply not necessary. And that was not very well appreciated during that period of time, nor is it since in many respects, but I think it's true. And also in terms of complacency, the question is what to do about Russia, the Soviet Union, because it does have this ideology about, taking over the world and class struggle and so forth. And the complacent person would say, well, it's really rotten to the core. It'll fall apart by its own sale. And that's basically what happened. by 1985 to 1990, it was just for basically self-destructive. It was did not fall apart because anything that the West did particularly. So it wasn't deterred from war because there's nothing to deter. And its problems were not constructed by the outside, but by the inside. Some of the earliest people writing about this, like George Kennan, talked about its seeds of its destruction are are already there. And that was true, though it took a long time before they nurtured. So complacency, just sort of hanging back and letting it happen, would make a lot. Complacency is, in ordinary bargaining. You go into a store and you want to buy something, you sort of assume the other guy is, being honest, though of course trying to get the best price and so forth. And if you come up with an agreeable, complacent agreement in which you don't get everything you want, the other guy doesn't get everything he wants, that's not bad at all. That's the way ordinary commerce goes on. It's not getting into fights over things, but it's basically finding out how we can reach agreement. And by and large, that's happened. That's one of the reasons, of course, that war hasn't happened. Instead of people going to war, they've used other methods to try to tinker with with problems that they find as they find them. Some of these are unpleasant, such as economic sanctions, or tinkering in civil wars, or lobbing cyber balloons and so forth, or propagandizing and so forth. But they're not anything like war.
This morning, I was trying to think of the reasons why any politician avoids the word complacency, and why I don't think I've ever heard a politician use that word. And the two that I kind of came up with, I want to know your feedback on it. One is the sheer financials of the war machine and the manufacturing and the jobs that they want to protect. So one is financial. And the second reason is that fear can drive votes and rally a public. So is there any accuracy that the main reason why a politician would want to keep this is because fear can move voters, and the financials have become so massive and the industry is so large, they don't want to slow it?
Yeah, well, it's not so much an economic thing; it's basically a strategic thing. Basically, being complacent about a threat. One of the things that's also very important in the book is basically we've exaggerated the degree to which there are strategic threats, particularly military threats. I've already talked about it with respect to the Cold War, but currently we're doing it, I think, with respect to Russia and with respect to China. There's a lot of unpleasant things in both countries, but international war is not likely to be part of the menu, and letting them advance. And letting them self-destruct may be the best policy. What I'm very much opposed to is doing things just for the fact of doing things. That's what economic sanctions have been. Basically, you can sort of act like you're doing something, and you launch economic sanctions against people, or sometimes a whole people, and you feel like you've done something. But the record for economic sanctions of changing policy, which is their point, is remarkably bad. Cuba, we've been sanctioning Cuba since 1960. That's considerably longer you've been around. And Cuba is still thumbing its nose at the United States. There has been no change of policy, but sanctions have simply totally not worked. And by and large, that's the case elsewhere. They also can be very destructive. They particularly of ordinary people. They were launched against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1990s. And tens of thousands of people died because of them. And I think that's happening now in Iran and also North Korea. The sanctions are not changing their policy, and what they are doing is causing economic problems, which ultimately leads to human suffering and human death.
I had no idea that sanctions weren't proven effective. All I see on face value is a big press release or a big announcement from a politician talking about a sanctions, and you think that is a power move, but you're saying historically there hasn't been notable policy change with every sanction.
Right. There's a lot of academic studies on this. I'm at the Cato Institute, and there's a policy analysis paper by a guy named Hanania, which basically looks at sanctions. You can find it basically, it's called Sanctions ineffective, convenient, and very destructive. And it's something like that. At any rate, what he points out is that there's been a huge number of studies of economic sanctions. And what happens is, there's also an article in The Guardian just a couple of weeks ago by Simon Jenkins on this. What happens is that they impose the sanctions, and they do cause pain. Okay, right, got that. The sanctions on Cuba has caused pain in China, in Cuba. So they say, well, the sanctions are working, they're causing pain. And the answer to that is that's not the reason you're doing the sanctions. You're causing the pain because you think the pain will cause the policy to change. If we sanction Iran, according to Pompeo, for example, the former Secretary of State, the Iranians will rise up and overthrow the Ayatollah, and then this fanatical regime that's in charge. Well, that hasn't happened, and so consequently, there's no question that's causing pain, and it's successful in that sense. But the point of them is not to cause pain, but for the pain they cause to cause changes in policy, and the record on that is unbelievably bad.
So it's not only unethical, but it's completely ineffective. That's actually very sad. And I'm glad you brought that up because I had no idea. I always took the press releases and the press conferences at face value. I wanted to shift to some of the younger people that might be listening and the rise of support from guys like Bernie Sanders or Andrew Yang. Young people especially, want to find resources for someone to have health care and for medical bill not to wipe them out. And the debate is always, where's that money coming from? And so far, the most public solution is taxation on the rich, but very few politicians talk about cutting down on defense spending and how much that can be. Is it fair to say that that should be an argument for young people to get behind the cutting down of defense, that there are billions of dollars that could be freed up? Do you think that's a important thing that politicians are leaving off the table when instead of talking about taxing Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, maybe we can cut 10%, 40% or whatever of the defense and open up a lot more money than they could ever through taxes?
Yeah, that's a central argument of the book as well. About basically, it's not only for young people but old people can decide that the defense budget is much too high. But it's very hard to do politically. You don't find anybody on the left or the right really talking about it in any measured sense. One thing you could talk about, I would encourage people to think more about this, is the abject failure of American military policy, particularly in this century. They went into Iraq, they went into Afghanistan. The results of those wars have been hundreds of thousands of people have died. Put in cosmic terms here, or really tight terms, the number of people who have died in Iraq because of the American invasion is 100 times higher than the number of the people who died on 9/11.
Wow.
Now, if 9/11 was the cause for it, in fact, that's a low estimate. It might be 200 times. Double what has happened. And something similar, though not quite as horrible, perhaps, has happened in Afghanistan. They went in, they didn't know what they were doing in both those wars. They won initially. The initial game was, of course, to take out the incumbent regimes, which they did, but they didn't know how to put a nation back together, and militarily or otherwise. And the suffering has been intense in both of those countries. The United States has also intervened militarily in Libya under Obama, and that was a total fiasco. They got rid of Gaddafi, and it devolved into this civil war, which has been really horrible. In fact, the American military, as my book points out, has won no wars since World War II, except ones that were against enemies that scarcely existed. Panama, Grenada, Kosovo, and the first Gulf War. In which case there basically was nothing there. The opponents simply ran. In all other wars, they've either at best gotten a stalemate or they've lost. So the question is, when you ask somebody, thank you for your service, My question is, are you being served? The United States is now spending what will be well over $1 trillion over time
Wow.
in simply modernizing its nuclear fleet. And the question is, do we really need over $1 trillion on that? Who to do what? To deter? To deter who? It didn't. It wasn't necessary during the Cold War, and it's even less necessary now. We're living in a world that's basically substantially at peace, international peace. And there are plenty of problems, there are plenty of difficulties and so forth. But war is simply a big war, certainly not an international war, even of any variety, is certainly not much on the agenda. So do we need these massive forces? What good are they? What good have they done? So anyway, my book tries to deal with that, and there are a few other people saying that. But that pop proposition, maybe you disagree with me, and people are free to do so. But has they done any good? They did not do anything to stop World War III, the Soviet Union starting a war, because they weren't going to do it no matter what. Have they been beneficial anyplace else? They did change the leadership in Panama and in Grenada, and that was somewhat clumsy actually, but nonetheless they were successful. And they did run over Saddam Hussein's forces in 1991. But basically, none of those forces were willing to fight for Saddam Hussein anyway. All they had to do was show up, and everybody surrendered. The whole war, in fact, was one of crowd control. You know, what do you do with all these people who are surrendering? There's one case, in fact, of a female reporter from suburban Washington, and she wandered into the battlefield area, and 200 Iraqis tried to surrender to her. And she was armed, as far as I know, with nothing more than a pencil.
It sounds like there are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs, and regardless of the trade-off, war is never justified, at least right now. I wanted to ask you about the realistic threat of North Korea from a social media or even just a mainstream media perspective. Anytime Kim Jong-un or anything happens in North Korea, it is front page news. It has caused a lot of anxiety in the population. I wanted to ask you how real that threat is or how overblown it might be.
It's totally overblown. And we're losing an opportunity. I've discussed this quite a bit in the book. And I also have a separate paper on it at Cato. Kim Jong-un seems to be very much unlike his predecessors. Because what he wanted to do, he had this two-pronged policy. One is because the United States seems to be a threat to us, we have to have ability to retaliate against the United States since the development of his nuclear weapons. And George W. Bush did say at one time, my goal now after 9/11 is to rid the world of evil. And in a speech a few months later, he says, evil is in North Korea, also Iraq and Iran, the axis of evil. So the goal was basically to eliminate the regime in North Korea, and they didn't like that. So that's one of the reasons they went toward nuclear weapons. The other part of the policy, Kim Jong-un's policy, is to actually sort of follow China or Vietnam, or to a degree Singapore, in opening his country up to the world economy. And I think what we should be doing is forgetting about nuclear weapons. They're not going to give those up. It's hopeless. And instead, basically trying to bring it into the family of nations, with the South Koreans taking the lead. I'm not sure it'll work. They're a very insecure regime in North Korea. But basically, complacency would be my recommended policy in that area. Let's see if we can make this work. They aren't really much of a threat.
So hypothetically, if the U.S. was open with North Korea, there was trade going on, there was travel, they could earn money from Americans. They would almost need Americans for the economy if there was true integration. So it sounds like you believe it is tremendously overblown that North Korea is not in any way an existential threat.
No, not an existential threat. It's not a threat or an existential threat to anybody. It basically is a screwball country with a screwball regime. And one of the things that will happen is that if it becomes more economically developed, the people on top will get much of the riches. It's not, exactly egalitarian. But nonetheless, what we're doing is punishing the ordinary Koreans, that's North Koreans, who are dying They're much shorter than, the diet has been terrible for decades, and they're shorter than the South Koreans because of dietary problems, and a lot of people have died. And basically, that's been partly caused by mostly by the regime, but also by the sanctions on the regime. So we should open up and explore the possibilities. Kim Jong-un has made some reforms in the economy. They're halting, they're sort of quiet, and they're not totally clear that they're going to be followed up. What we should be doing is encouraging him to follow up. And I think the possibility is there. And at any rate, it seems immoral not to give that a good try.
So wrapping up, we talked a lot about overblown threats and the fact that a war is tremendously unlikely. But I wanted to ask a final question. If there is a regime, if there is a country that you are in some ways concerned about, or looking ahead 10 years, 20 years, where there is something that you're at least measurably concerned about, or what we should be most concerned about, because we spent 99% talking about what we shouldn't be. I just want to know if there's any things that keep you up at night or make you anxious.
Well, no. I mean, there are things like global warming, and there are things like refugees, and there are things like the pandemic and so forth. But in terms of international security, I think we're in good shape. The chief problem has to deal, insofar as there is one, from a military standpoint, is China's desire to get Taiwan back. I think that has been set back a lot because of their policy in Hong Kong. But neither Russia nor China has Hitlerian ambitions to take over the world or expand. They want to play a bigger role. In many cases, that might be a good thing. Maybe China and Russia can help in Afghanistan. Maybe Russia can help, in particular, with Syria now, another place where the United States screwed up big time, and getting it back into some semblance of normalcy, even if we've got a bad regime running it. It's better than the war was. So I don't see any real security risks, except possibly things coming out of the Taiwan thing. That's the only one. I think mostly what is happening is that countries are no longer using war to settle their differences. They're sometimes using unpleasant methods like sanctions, or like intervening in people's civil wars, like has happened horribly, both in Syria and Yemen, with propaganda, with election interference and stuff like that. And it's not clear that's much of a danger, but it's certainly not war, though it's sometimes confused with war. War is where people get killed. And a war has to be at least 1,000 battle deaths per year by standard definition. We're not getting anything like that, with the possible exception of something coming out of Taiwan. So I'm pretty sanguine, and it seems to be complacency renders itself. Russia is not going to give back Ukraine's Crimea. Somebody put it, Crimea is going back to Ukraine the same time Texas goes back to Mexico. And we just have to accept it, I think, and work with it. People at the time thought, well, now he's going to take Crimea, he's going to take over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They're not saying that anymore because it's quite clear that's not the case. So I think things are pretty good in terms of international law. We have problems with this economic sanctions being incredible, hurting people bad and killing them in some cases, and we should work on that. Mostly, however, the world is doing pretty well in the sense of cooperation. You've seen that a bit with the COVID thing. International trade is continuing to expand, not as much as I'd like, perhaps, but nonetheless. And more people are saying, let's get together on these issues through the United Nations, through other bilateral agreements, or whatever. And mostly, it's in a pretty good direction. And in particular, it seems to me that a big international war is simply not on the agenda, very likely in the future.